finds it very difficult to handle that. But that is definitely a challenge that is there. Much less interest in the global plans. There is also a real challenge in the sense that there is less money for missions. There has been a time, I admit it's quite a while ago, but that for every dollar that our members gave in tithe, they would give about 25 cents for mission offerings. And it's closer to about 5 cents now than you know, yeah, it's around that amount. So that is really a challenge for those who want to have funds to give subsidies to all kinds of projects around the world. There is less money for that kind of thing because the emphasis is more on local needs. And so if you need something in many Western churches for a local situation, you want to buy a new piano, no problem, somebody will give it to you. You want to have the same amount for some for mission projects far away, it becomes much more difficult. We have seen that some divisions in the world were always paying more than other divisions. And that was certainly true of the North American division. At one time, they paid 10 to 12% of their total income to the General Conference to be redistributed around the world. Now, currently, there is a process going on that will bring the NAD, the North American division, at the same level with other divisions. They are not going to pay more. And part of it is because they say we have sufficient challenges of our own. Also, of course, there is the idea that the rest of the world is telling us what to do, and they are not willing to actually think too carefully about our needs and what we would want. So if they don't care about that, then why should we continue supporting them with such huge amount of money? So some would say the international solidarity is under threat. Well, this is a complicated matter, but it's definitely also part of the tendency to keep the funds more at home, to think more locally than globally. There is less interest in long-term mission service. A mission term, in most cases, is about 6 years. There are still people who go out for 6 years. Often people do not last that long in the mission field. And there are only very few that would be interested in a second term or even a lifelong service in the mission. Well, that was quite common a couple of decades ago. There is an increasing interest in, on the other hand, in such things as ADRA and Maranatha, because that is very tangible. And that is something also organizations which are more trusted than maybe the the church organization in general. So these are challenges for institutional Adventism. There are also some issues regarding spirituality. When it comes to spiritual life and the resources for spiritual nurture, we have something that you might refer to as institutionalized spirituality. That is, things are organized from the top down, and they are supposed to be the same all around the world. And so we have the traditional Sabbath school, which is supposed to use the same lesson quarterly, which is supposed to work with the same kind of organization, with the same kind of mission focus all around the world. Truth is that, of course, it doesn't work anymore so well in many Western settings. And the same is true for prayer meetings, week of prayer. Now, here in the Netherlands, last week was the week of prayer. But the churches I went to preach at the beginning of the week of prayer, the church that I went to, I did not read the reading. I preached the sermon. They didn't want to hear the reading. And there are very few people who are participating in this traditional event, something like the missionary book of the year. Now, I bet that most people in this Sabbath school class do quite a bit of reading, but I wonder whether you know what the missionary book of the year was last year and what will be the missionary book of the year next year. In the non-Western part of the world, there is often great enthusiasm for that project. The book is chosen, the book is printed in millions of copies. But in the Western world, that type of prescribed spirituality that everybody must buy into, that doesn't really work that well. I would think that is the same for the famous or infamous Revival and Reformation initiative that was started, what is it now, about 6-7 years ago. How do you revive the church? How do you reform the church? This revival and reformation is based on something that is thought of from the top down, and it is being pushed through the channels. This is what must be emphasized. These are the materials, these are the websites, and this works well in the more modern part of the world, but it certainly does not work that well in the postmodern part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And by the way, if you look at the material for the Revival and Reformation initiative, and to my knowledge, there has not been any real careful analysis of what it has actually brought. But if you look at the material, it's almost identical to materials, sermons, slogans, etc., that were there when Robert Pearson was the president of the General Conference. It also had the same name, Revival and Reformation. Something the church also believes in, the modern church believes in, is a mass distribution of Ellen G. White books. And that is not something that the more postmodern Adventists buy into. And also here, actually, to my knowledge, there is very few research to find out whether this actually works to some extent, whether these books are actually read. There is some incidental evidence that somebody read a book and then found his way or her way to the church, but that's about it. At the same time, there is a resistance to different spirituality projects that maybe are a little bit more postmodern. And most of you may have heard of the concept of spiritual formation. And this has become a sentence, a formula that some people in Silver Springs really don't want to hear, because it is supposedly referring to some kinds of spiritual life, mysticism, Eastern religions, and it is not really what Adventist Christians should be dealing with. The thing came to a head when John Dugdale, who is now retired, his last post was president of Walla Walla University, when he wrote a little book, entitled Hunger, which dealt with different ways of pursuing a spiritual life. And some of the words that he used, some of the terminology that he used was so suspect, because it was not the kind of terminology that we were used to, that his book was actually first published by the Review and Herald and was then taken out of circulation because people did not feel comfortable about it. But this was an approach to spirituality that did not follow the institutionalized kind of approach that the church, the modern church, really likes. And something similar, I think, was with the One Project, which did not come from the higher organizations as something that the world should do, but it was some pastors in Southern California who initiated this, and it became quite popular, the One Project, but there was immediate suspicion that maybe it was not careful enough in emphasizing the specific Adventist doctrines, and so it ran into a lot of problems. And when I look at it, I think there is the issue of modern versus postmodern. We'll come back to that. Issues at the congregational level. Worship style, what are the options? The traditional, or is there more variety, as the postmodern person would probably like? In local churches, the focus on small groups, is that always positive, or is that maybe for some people becoming not only something in the church, but actually the church for them? This is what church means for them, just with a few people where they can share their ideas. But is this something that we should worry about? It's something that plays at the congregational level. Something else that plays at the congregational level is that very often we see now in Western churches a blurring of the lines between members and non-members. For the traditional Adventist, there's a clear dividing line between a member and a non-member. If you are not a baptized member, you cannot even sing in the choir. We, in the local church where Afi and I attend, we had a lady who had been active in the children's Sabbath school for many years. She was highly appreciated, but then we suddenly had a new local pastor who found out that she was not actually a baptized member. And he was very strict in adhering to the church manual. And before too long, the lady was no longer allowed to be part of the children's Sabbath school. Something that hadn't bothered anyone in the church became an issue. And this pastor was clearly a very modern pastor, and wanted to have it clear what the difference between a member and a non-member. Of course, we have never seen that lady and her husband again in the church. They were so hurt that that was the end of being part of this community. And then at the congregational level, the issue of church discipline. Again, when I look at my own experience and in the church in the Netherlands, but that is true also for churches in other countries, Western countries, there are many people who live together without having gone to the church and or the town hall, live together without being formally married. Now, whatever we think about that, that's a given. And whether we like it or not, most young people in the Netherlands and also countries around us will live together before they actually get married. Now, there are some churches where that is a matter of church discipline. Churches that are more modern, and these are churches often mainly composed of immigrant members, they will want to discipline those young people. And because this cannot be tolerated, this is immoral, this must be totally, there must be put a stop to it. In other more postmodern churches, you might say, their discipline does not work. If you have these young people and you would discipline them because they have moved in together, then we will never see them again. They will simply not want to be part of the community that has no understanding for where they are. So this is an issue in many local congregations. And I think it goes back to this modern, postmodern thing. With regard to the individual believer, some who are more rational, others more non-rational, some heavily interested in doctrinal fine print, others do not ask so much, and this is the postmodern person. Is it true, but rather, what does it do for you? Some people say you need to take the whole doctrinal package, all the 28 fundamental beliefs, with all it implies, where others are much more selective and they pick and choose. The openness to spiritual gifts differs from place to place, and then there is quite a bit of cross-border shopping in the sense that between Adventist churches, people do not necessarily attend church where they live, but they're much more inclined to even travel over considerable distances to go to a local church, which is more to their liking, that they feel more, where they feel more at home. And even some will actually leave the Seventh-day Adventist church and feel that as Christians, they are better off if they join a kind of congregation that gives them a better satisfaction in their spiritual life. So there are issues at the global level, there are issues at the congregational level, at the individual believers level. But there are then these challenges overall that are to be found in, for the whole church. How do we stay together in this world of diversity of people who are modern and people who are postmodern? How do we stay together theologically? For instance, when it comes to our view of inspiration, Bible, the inspiration of Ellen White. When it comes to our view on ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, is the church that small Seventh-day Adventist Christian unit, or is the church much wider than that? And what kind of a role, what kind of place do we as Seventh-day Adventist believers have in the Church of God worldwide? Staying together in our eschatology. Many are still very focused on every detail of the explanation for Daniel and the Revelation that we have been, that we are used to ever since Uriah Smith. But, well, of course, also other books that have been published, but basically the historicism and the traditional pictures that we have of the end time events, while there are many who no longer feel that that is something that even interests them or seems credible, and they have a much different kind of picture of eschatology. It's a lot of difference as to whether you read the book on commentary of the Daniel and Revelation by the brothers. What is their name? One wrote book on Daniel, one wrote the book on the Revelation. One is at Andrews and the other is at the Adventist Health University. Anyway, when you read those books and you take the new book by Siegfried Tonstad, those are a world apart. So which is it? Staying together in policy. And there, of course, the issue of women's ordination is always in the background. Finding and keeping a balance between doctrinal emphasis and spirituality. Challenges for the worldwide. And to some extent, to a major extent, I believe, that has to do with the tension between modern and postmodern. So how do we deal with this divide? And I think I've said it before that for some people, the big problem is to deal with conservative versus liberal. Now, it is true, there are sections of the church that are more liberal, sections of the church that are more conservative, because these words, they can mean different things to different people. Most of us who call ourselves liberal would be called very conservative in the eyes of many liberal Protestant and liberal Catholics outside. So what is liberal? What is conservative? But I think beyond that divide, beyond that issue, there is modern versus postmodern. Conservative, liberal, you can put your hands on that a little easier. Listen to a sermon, see what they write, and you'll find, yes, this is more conservative, this is more liberal. But modern versus postmodern is a way of looking at things, goes much deeper and has a much wider implication. And I think that is the main issue behind many of the issues that we are dealing with, that we see in the church at various levels. Now, let me in the next 15 or 20 minutes contrast modern Adventists with postmodern Adventists. And of course, this is very general. And maybe there is no one who really fits into that category. And most of us would be a little bit of both. But just to get it on the table, a modern Adventist is someone who demands certainties, truth with a capital T, absolutes. It's either false or right, and there is no middle way. A modern Adventist will defend historical positions. In an extreme way, this is done by so-called historic Seventh-day Adventists who want to go back to everything the pioneers did and believed. But in general, there are many people who feel that what is done in the past, it's safe to stick with that and maybe go back to that rather than have all these different philosophies and different theories floating around. Let's stick with what we always had, with what we always said. Doctrinal purity. Well, that has to do with the absolutes. Everything that is said in the 28 fundamental beliefs is true. every sentence, every comma is something that we cannot change. We cannot try to be flexible. And many modern Adventists would want to go further in defining what we believe. We have seen that, for instance, the fundamental belief number 6 about the creation was recently further defined in order to be sure that there cannot be any kind of heretical position. And there are quite a few who feel that there are other things that can be a little stricter so that every kind of misunderstanding can be excluded. Modern Adventist, strong emphasis on eschatology and on the traditional picture, the traditional timetable. They may not want to make the extravagant kind of schemas, which you sometimes see with all kinds of lines and very, very complicated explanation with timelines, etc. But in general, the modern Adventist has a strong emphasis on eschatology in the traditional mold that we are accustomed to. Modern Adventist is anti-ecumenical, and that leads to major problems in a number of countries. Can we be a member of an ecumenical body, of a national council of churches? A modern Adventist will tend to say, no, we cannot, because they are wrong and we are right, and we should be careful not to get infiltrated by their ideas. It's still, for instance, a major problem in Germany, where part of the church wants to join the National Council of Churches, and part of the church is very much against it. In the Netherlands, we are an associate member of the National Council of Churches, a kind of compromise. Now, of course, an associate member is a member who is supposed to become, after a process, is supposed to become a member. But we have discussed that with the leaders of the National Council of Churches. In fact, it was when I had something to do with it. And they said, well, if you want to stay an associate member forever, that's fine, but we'll treat you as a full member. But if you need that in order to keep the peace with part of your membership, so be it. In France and in Belgium, our church really has no option but to join some other churches in order to be a partner for discussions with the government. If we are not part of a organizations with other churches, we have no voice at the table. So it's a very complicated situation. And I know the situation has played also in the United States in the past, but a modern Adventist is very clear that we should have nothing to do with Babylon, nothing to do, because we know where it ends. And that's a major issue. Modern Adventists, they like unity in terms of uniformity. They like the fact that when you travel and you go to an Adventist church, you find the same kind of thing that you find at home. You like the fact that you have the same Sabbath school quarterly with the same topic, etc. And the modern Adventist is thankful that we have such a strong organization, that we have the general conference, the divisions, the unions, and they say, this is really has helped the church to grow and be as strong as we are today. That is a very global, general picture of what would be the modern Adventist. But then, the postmodern Adventist will have much less interest in doctrinal fine print. We said that already a few times. Will allow for diversity in doctrine. The postmodern Adventist also deals in a different way with church authority. Does not have the veneration for the higher organizations, the GC, the division, the unions. In fact, they will often question whether we actually need all of this. We see that under the influence of postmodernity, the role of the pastor in churches that are more postmodern than modern, that the role of the pastor differs. His authority is not derived from the fact that he has been appointed by the conference. It's not derived from the fact that he is officially the pastor and therefore he has authority. No, he has to earn the authority. And only after a certain period, when he is trusted, when he has earned the right to authority, then he will be accepted in that way. The way the church manual is dealt with is very significant. In modern churches, the church manual often has almost a semi-inspired status. Now, true enough, in most churches, there is a selective use of the material in the church manual. But, and I know this from my country here in the Netherlands, there are certain churches that the church manual is being very religiously followed. There are other churches where the church manual is never mentioned, doesn't play any role. And while some of the major rules are followed, because we have always done that, we're very willing to actually make exceptions and do it differently when the need arises. So the authority of the church manual, and thereby also the role of church discipline, differs significantly. And the postmodern Adventist is not really that much interested in the church manual and will be very careful in dealing with discipline. Will it actually work? Will it actually help the persons that we are talking about? The postmodern Adventist may be more open to celebration, praise, may probably have a decreased interest in regular Sabbath school, be more open to new spiritual projects that are not part of the institutionalized kind of spirituality that we talked about. And the postmodern Adventist will be more open and be more willing to learn from other faith communities, and maybe even adopt some of the programs that other church communities have, such as, for instance, the Alpha Course and some other projects. The postmodern Adventist has a hesitancy, like all postmodern people, towards total commitment. And we just refer to the blurring of the lines between members and non-members. If that happens, a postmodern Adventist doesn't really worry about it too much. Has an interest in practical service, ADRA, food banks, you name it, and is much more ecumenical nationally, but certainly also locally in the city or town where their local church is situated. And that would be true for the pastors as well. A pastor who is more postmodern in his outlook, he will look for contact with his fellow religious leaders in town or in the village. Then the postmodern Adventist may be more open towards a different kind of lifestyle and will maybe look more for principles rather than rules. And that may result in the fact that they may use low alcoholic beverages. I think we do not see a lot of use of strong alcohol in our church, but we certainly see in many places where people who are, I cannot avoid the word postmodern, that they will drink a glass of wine, certainly if you live in France, or drink a glass of beer, certainly when you live in Germany. And caffeine containing beverages in many places, that is no longer an issue that is being talked about. Certainly not in churches where the postmodern people are in the majority. And this may be something specifically Dutch, but I can tell you there are very few churches in the Netherlands, Adventist churches in the Netherlands, where you will go home without having the opportunity of having a cup of coffee. Postmodern Adventists have less problems with cohabitation, are more willing to see personal circumstances that may lead to divorce, and would be less judgmental, and they would certainly also have a more tolerant attitude towards the LGBTQ, etc. people. So the postmodern Adventist and the modern Adventist, they are certainly different. Now, the modern Adventist, you may not see clear examples of somebody who fits all these details, and the postmodern, maybe not somebody who fits all the things that I have just mentioned. But I hope that you can see that there is definitely a difference in mentality, a different way in which Adventists approach their faith, and the way their faith is practiced in their community, modern versus postmodern. And when we have looked at the elements of modernism and postmodernism in the past few weeks, I think that these things that we have mentioned are also kind of reflected in what we have mentioned today. Now, modern versus postmodern. It's my conviction it's not one or the other. There are good things in the more modern position. There are good things in the more postmodern position. Can we find a balance? There are challenges at different levels in the church. Are we courageous enough to recognize those challenges and to try to work with those challenges, to think them through, have discussions and debate at all levels, and where necessary, are we willing to change? And when it comes to the future, are we willing to allow the Spirit to lead? So the question is, how does the church reinvent itself? Or maybe rather, how do we listen to the Spirit when we are dealing with all these various issues at these various levels? That was the point where I say amen. And I think I tried to be on time, and here in the Netherlands, it's exactly 8:30. So back to you, David.
You got to unmute yourself, David. There you go.
Thank you very much, Reinder. We are benefiting this time, not merely from your scholarship, but from your many years of successful administrative work in the life of the church. So you have perspective that's very, very valuable to us. One question we might want to consider as we leave and then come back perhaps with it, and that is, what percentage of the Adventists around the world would we describe as postmodern? when we think that only maybe 95% of the Adventists around the world live in North America, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. No, I meant only 5% live in those areas, whereas 95% of the Adventists live elsewhere. Then we ask ourselves, how many postmodern people are there even in these regions? So maybe there aren't that many postmodern people around the world, all things considered. Having said that, we ought not to presume that people who live in other parts of the world are necessarily modern. The prejudice there might not be justified. So let's reconvene at 11:52. I think that's right, 11:52 from now, 10 minutes. And let's have a good break. Dr. Bruinsma needs a break after having preached and now taught today.
Yes, busy day, but pleasure.
Yes, okay, we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand, either electronically or wave to me. I'll try to see you.
Forrest, McKinley
And
here.
Juan, you're not supposed to show off your grandchildren. I'm sorry. It's against the rules.
Forrest.
Yeah, who is that?
Hey, this is McKinley. Hey,
Oh, I got you. I've got you down here from last week.
okay, good. So just put me like maybe 2 persons in.
Oh, 2.
Please.
All right, not 3 or okay, I'll get you in there. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got Danilo and Jeff, he raised his hand. Eduardo, I see your hand up.
Now you see how Sabbath school is for Grandpa?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now is a break.
Okay. Oh, and Peter, I see you. And Juan,
Yes.
you can't talk about your grandchildren. You just have to stay on the topic.
See how my Sabbath school was, and I told him that was not boring. Okay. No. Okay, let's stop now.
I love this picture. I just really like it.
Dave,
Yes.
it's Jeff here. Did you mean 11:42 or 11:52?
I said 11:52, didn't I?
Yeah, but
Yeah. Let's just take a little more time. I think Reinder might need a little bit more time too. He seems to be doing well, but in need of a little bit of a break.
That's true.
all right, just raising a point of order. Thank you.
Oh, it's a good point of order.
I'm okay, and I'll be there whenever you start again.
Hi, Reinder.
Hello.
Oh, where are you? I can't tell where you are.
Let
Hi.
me see.
Oh, the
Yeah.
camera's here.
Oh, can you see me or can I see you? Oh, there you are. There you are.
Yes, yes.
Well, oh, hi, how you doing?
Look over here.
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm a technological idiot. So I don't know where the camera is and it's probably.
There are worse things, but we see you and we hear you loud and clear.
I've been thinking about you and your eye surgery and trying to screw up my courage to go and have it also.
Okay.
Your wife.
So, well, Afje is seeing you again.
There you go.
And well, I'm going to have some pretty soon.
Oh, you are? Also cataract?
Yeah, because they told me that if I don't do it, then I may be in trouble if I sit again for my driver's license.
Oh.
So, well, we'll see. But Afje, it's, well, you tell her.
Well, I'm a bit unfortunate, but I have an infection of the retina.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I
so-
know you had to go back a couple of times. Have you now had a third problem?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah, it's a never-ending story, but at least you see
Yeah.
reasonably well.
yeah.
And you
So,
can drive, right? If you
so
ever-
Sorry?
you can drive.
I haven't driven. No.
it's about time that she starts to drive again.
Aha. Are you
Because
getting tired of chauffeuring her?
Now I have to chauffeur her all around, you know.
She might be never get well enough to drive then.
Yeah. I will.
Don't start that.
I like being chauffeured. I like when Jeff drives and I don't have to.
Mhm.
But as a matter of fact, we drove from Amsterdam to the north of the country, right past waterland.
Uh-huh.
We drove past there when you were here, and
Yeah.
it's such a beautiful
I know.
piece of land, and it is just water and land and nothing else,
Mhm.
and birds
Yeah.
and a couple of sheep,
I
endlessly.
remember. We at least in part of it, I remember because we
Mhm.
drove through that area looking for windmills and stuff.
Yeah, well, we look forward, you know, to a normalization of things, and we're not there yet. We would have liked to be in Sweden around this time.
Oh, sure.
Our oldest granddaughter had her birthday, and we had wanted to go there, but no, that was not. Actually, we're not supposed to travel outside of the country, except we have an emergency. So it's still the end is not quite in sight. But
But
as
it's
soon as-
getting worse over here.
yeah,
Yeah, we've
I
seen
hope
that.
we understand. We're fine, but you know.
but
we
as soon as things get better, then I hope we can continue our last aborted visit to California,
Yeah.
and we would like to welcome this couple from
We'd
Jeff.
like to come too.
yeah.
Well, your room is ready. It's still waiting for you. so-
Okay, all right. Well, we may just be on on your doorstep one of these days.
Oh, that would be nice.
Yeah.
We can't go anywhere either. Even in the States, like New York doesn't want anybody to come from.
Yeah.
anywhere
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we follow it very, very
Yeah, closely.
closely what is happening in the States at all different levels. But yeah,
This is a good presentation, and a very nice, I don't want to say compression, but really a structural outline. I just finished reading last week Gil Valentine's biography of J.N. Andrews.
oh, that's a fabulous book, isn't it?
Yes, I'm carefully, it took a while because I have to read all the footnotes because
Yeah,
there's so much information.
that's right. That's one of the books where you really need to read the footnotes as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, it is not easy reading because these people were not the saints
No,
that you thought they were.
no.
Yeah.
Now you're talking like a postmodern.
Oh, yes. But yeah,
I like the old modern days where.
yeah, okay. No, you are also postmodern.
Yeah, he is. You know,
Yeah.
the wine drinking, that was a real problem with the European Adventists at the beginning
Yeah.
of work, according to that book they talked about. Poor Andrews trying to get the people in Switzerland to stop
Yeah.
drinking wine.
Right. He never quite succeeded.
No, but he didn't take it up himself. But he
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
he didn't.
Yeah.
So the Dutch, their greatest sin is drinking coffee.
Some do,
beer.
yes.
You guys haven't made it to beer yet, like the Germans.
Well, they've made it to beer, but probably low
All three.
No, there are some Seventh-day Adventists, and they are not only young people who will drink a glass of wine. Well, I personally have not started doing that, and am not planning to do that because of all the things that you see that alcohol is doing in society. And so if you belong to a community that has said no to alcohol, then historically, then I really don't see any reason why we should change that, but rather continue to be examples. But, you know, not use any kind of biblical arguments that, you know, because you really have to twist things. And to say that Christ created apple juice or whatever, grape juice. Well, that's,
Right.
yeah. Well, somebody said it's good that Jesus was not a Seventh-day Adventist, because he would not have changed water into wine, but he would have changed all the wine into water.
Well, you know, I wouldn't drink wine because I want to know for sure when my foot's going to hit the ground, you know, because especially now at my age, I don't want to fall some way or another.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't fault the young people as long. It's easy. You don't know if you're going to become an alcoholic or not, though. That's one problem.
But I think, you know, what we just said is that people who are possibly more postmodernly inclined, they are looking for principles rather than strict rules. And, you know, it's probably less healthy to dine at McDonald's every day than it is to have an occasional glass of wine.
That's a proven thing.
So
That's absolutely true.
yeah.
But that's happening. It's permeating. That kind of thinking permeates now our church, and of course, as you pointed out already, the society in general. But I don't think it. Well, we've abandoned maybe some of our less sturdy doctrines. And reading that book reminded me of things that we don't talk about anymore, that what were things that seemed to be of monumental importance at the time.
Well, the subject of jewelry, you know, is still very much alive. And
Okay.
okay, but
Yeah, it's hard to find a young lady.
All right.
11:50.
You know, the other thing is, if you talk to Bonnie Dwyer, and I remember them saying the most frequently requested issue of Spectrum back issues is the one they did on jewelry. Any other back issue, that's the one they have trouble having enough of to give to people. That's a problem if that's our focus.
yes,
Donna, you know the rule on jewelry, though.
What is
If it
that?
touches the skin, it's wrong. But if it is woven into the fabric and doesn't touch the skin, it's okay.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's good to know.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah,
for us.
yeah.
There was an article once in the review, and our son was staying with us. And I said, oh my, another article about jewelry. And our son heard me and he said, what are you talking about that still? He said, in Kosovo, people are dying every day and you're talking about a necklace.
Yes.
Yeah, see, he's right.
And it's some of these things that really put people off.
Yeah.
But in some churches, it's so ingrained, and among many of the people who've come from elsewhere, and where that has been taught to them. You know, I remember that we had once a meeting in Costa Rica, and all people who were at the meeting were supposed to go and preach on Sabbath. And so somebody came for me, and I was taken by a local pastor to a church somewhere in the in the countryside of Costa Rica. And then he was very uncomfortable with me. And I saw him look at my hand several times. So he saw my wedding ring. And but he found it so difficult to say something about that. But then we came to the church and we were in the little room, and then I said to him, I said, what is bothering you? And I said, is it this? Yes. Oh, I said, I'll take it off and put it in my pocket. Oh, thank you, Pastor, thank you. Because, I would have been in trouble it's such a big issue.
Mm.
We have a Ghanaian church in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, a large Ghanaian church.
I think you told
No,
us,
no.
Go ahead, tell us.
And there we were sitting there, and they were saying something in the Ghanaian language in Twi that we couldn't understand. And so after that, after I had preached there, I asked a person now what was going on there that we were not supposed to hear. Well, the pastor said, look, he said, I told them that the wife of the union president has jewelry, a necklace. Don't talk to her negatively about that, don't do that. But don't take that as an example that you are allowed to do it. He was very worried that, we would set a bad example. But this is something that, and there are several things like that I think are really part of modern Adventism that put many people off. And because it becomes a symbol for a way of life, a way of looking at things that they find narrow and restricted. So yeah.
About Afya's scarf. That's a very pretty scarf she's wearing today.
Thank you.
I probably gave it to her at some time.
That looks decorative to me. It's very nice.
Well, I think that.
Yeah, I don't see David back yet, so.
Oh.
Okay. I think he on purpose put 52, that he would have a bit more time.
Yeah, could be. The
Yeah.
older we get, so. Oh, there he is. Quit talking.
You're
about
right, Dr. Bruinsma. The conversation has already started, so let me stay out of the way.
No.
And that's just fine. Maybe I can make a comment here. Well, I'll come back because we have a colleague in Norway who typed something in on Facebook, and I'll look it up and I'll read it to you. So if you could put me in the queue for that purpose, Forrest, I would appreciate it. He's watching right now from Norway, and we're delighted for that. I would also say that this afternoon at 1 o'clock our time, the Adventist Society for Religious Studies will have a panel on higher education, Seventh-day Adventist higher education in the time of COVID and Black Lives Matter. Those two things, COVID and Black Lives Matter, and how they're affecting Adventist higher education. That's at 1 o'clock, and it will last till 2:30. I have sent you a link to that so that if you want to, you can click that link and be right there. I'm going to slip away about 12:30, 12:35 so that I can have some lunch before going to that session. But I'll leave this on. People can stay here at least until 12:55 when I'll turn it down so I can go to the ASRS meeting. So that's the way we're going. I recommend that you chime in to that meeting because you'll see Adventists from around the nation anyway, maybe some from around the world, talking about higher education in these very, very stressful times. Our colleges and universities were having a challenging time before COVID, and it's almost overwhelming now in view of what COVID has done and perhaps changed all of our lives forever. So having said that, let's get back to the conversation you were already having so well.
Okay, Donna and Jeff, you had a question that you put in the chat. Did you get that resolved or?
Jeff did.
Yeah.
Oh, Jeff.
Yeah. Reinder explained that he's modern and postmodern, but probably mostly postmodern. But I was wondering, modern indicates that there was something pre-modern. And I remember when he started a series, he talked about being pre-modern. I was wondering if he could remind us what that was. Was that before the General Conference took complete control of everything?
Well, the pre-modern period was when everything was related to what God would do and what God did, and to mystery. And whereas in the modern period, there people started finding rational explanations, and God was put more at a distance, and that brought along secularism. So pre-modern, well, some people are still pre-modern. And David, before we had our break, referred to maybe that other people around the world are not so much postmodern, but are more modern. And I would think that almost everywhere you find the three. You find people who are still quite pre-modern in many ways, modern and postmodern. And there is no clear distinction between somebody being totally modern and somebody being totally postmodern. At least I don't think so. But, you know, it is true what he said, what David said, that we are only 5% in the Western world of the total number of Seventh-day Adventists. And among those 5%, so that's roughly, what is it, 1 million? A little more than that. But there are around the world an increasing number of people, I think, that are also becoming postmodern. And they also look at the internet. And a couple of years ago, I taught for a couple of weeks at the University of Bugema University in Uganda. And I had not really talked about this topic of postmodernity there. But then towards the end, and I had a class of about 50, 60 students, they said, can you not devote a couple of periods to this particular topic? Says, why didn't you do that? And they kind of scolded me. And they told me, you know, we also have internet, and we also, you know, are thinking about things, and we're not that far behind. And that's true. You find many of our large institutions, city churches, where you have large numbers of Seventh-day Adventists that are on their way, at least, towards becoming postmodern. And many of the people in the Western world who have become postmodern, they are faced with the fact, and that is where the real rubber hits the road, that they feel that the leadership of the church and what they are doing and their approach to things is so completely modern that there is no way of connecting anymore. And somehow we have to tell those people that if they are modern, well, we should understand why that is. And we should try to help them understand how other people think differently. That is, I think, the beginning of trying to deal with these issues, making people understand what is actually happening, rather than, being so continuing to live in different worlds and just having this, this polarization. So I think you're right that maybe that it's a minority in the church, but it's an influential minority. And are we willing to give up on the church in the Western world? That is ultimately a problem that is behind there, because if we do not deal with this, then the church is going to disappear in some parts of the world.
Okay. Thank you, Reinder.
I
Or did you
think,
more-
yeah.
Did you have more you want to say on that? or-
No. I'm just hesitant to say some of these things because I may be coming on a little strong, but I'm really concerned that the church might actually disappear in some parts of the world.
Okay. By the way, if I like to jump in here, this is not a question so much, Reinder, but I pastored for several years and I had an interesting issue with cohabitation as a pastor, and it had nothing to do with young people. In the United States, if two seniors get married they had previous marriages and they're both widows, and they get married, that messes up a whole lot of stuff, from Social Security, different healthcare issues. And so I had seniors living, not sleeping in the same bed, but living in the same house because they couldn't afford to get married. They would lose a lot of benefits. And in California here, we have something called a registered domestic partnership, which is not recognized by the federal government. And so therefore, they don't lose all those benefits at the Social Security issues and income tax issues. But at the state level, they're considered married in all practical purposes. So it's an interesting issue that we're dealing with, and it's not just young people, which is an issue. But anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. McKinley, or did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, let me just respond and say that that is truly also in Europe, and certainly also in the Netherlands, a fact that some older people, for financial tax reasons, decide not to get married. And there is also something like a registered partnership, but that is in fact the same rights, the same duties as being married. So that doesn't help really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I talked to the widow of a pastor who, when her husband had died, she started a new relationship after some time. And I told her, why don't you get married? You're living together, and her new husband was also active in the church. So why don't you get married? And she said, well, I have a pension from the church because I was married with my husband for 30 or 35 years, and I lose that. And so I thought that really we need to look at that type of policies, because that's not fair. And we in fact make it impossible almost for people to get married.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to go to McKinley now.
Thank you, Forrest, for queuing me up early. Thank you, Elder Reinder, for your presentation again. I think it's a good framing of the challenges that Adventists face today. I want to go back to one of the questions you asked on your first presentation, and then a few considerations touching on spiritual and non-spiritual points, and that perhaps you can later comment on. So to the question you asked on one of your first presentations, here's my response. I like my Seventh-day Adventist view of the world, informed by all experiences, good, bad, and ugly, shortcomings, mistakes, successes, failures, disappointments, and reversals. And I think compared to other worldviews, I'm not so sure that I want to modify the Adventist worldview by either modern or postmodern labels. It's a worldview where, in relationship with God, blessed by God, we can be ever learning as knowledge, experience, insights, and understanding, plus human relationships informed by God's love unfold. So that's my thinking about the labels. Now for my quick observations, and there are 4 short considerations across the videos that Dr. Larson shared and the presentations that you gave earlier. So the first one is boundary conditions. I think a fundamental law of the universe, from my point of view, is that in the beginning, God created. And then the second boundary condition is the seventh-day Sabbath. If the postmodern view or framework quibbles with those boundary conditions, then I think that's a point of discussion. The second consideration is in the area of standards. I think God's health, happiness, and safety standards do apply. I think his peace of mind principles of living have great appeal. And then on the non-spiritual aspects, I think engineering and environmental standards apply. And it seems to me that many of the postmodern folks who quibble with standards would argue for environmental and engineering standards that protect human health, the air quality and water quality. So consistency would be an issue for the postmodern framework. On the question of meta-narratives, I think that one indisputable meta-narrative is that humanity lives in an entropic environment. Organisms decay, systems fail, relationships atrophy, humanity suffers, people die. Another non-spiritual aspect is that the laws of thermodynamics govern everything humans do. The information processes in the brain, the energy conversions in the mitochondria, the mechanical pumping work of the heart, the blood coursing through the veins of the postmodern. So I think that's a meta-narrative that is a reality that the postmodern framework might find a challenge either digesting or sort of dealing with. And so if the postmodern framework rejects these realities, how relevant should it be? And does it really deserve serious consideration? So I'll stop there and see if you can respond. And then if there's a quick follow-up, I'd like to do that. Thanks.
Well, okay. I jotted them down so that I would remember them. Your four considerations, one starting with boundary conditions, and you say that for you, the idea of creation and the idea of the Sabbath, that is non-negotiable. And if the postmodern worldview does not have room for those or make those important, then that causes a problem for you. I have absolutely no problem with that. I think that the Sabbath is a very important aspect that will actually appeal to many postmodern people. The idea of rest, the idea that, maybe actually an antidote to some of the things like burnout, etc., etc. The creation, I would think that every Adventist who is thinking about how things came to be will in some way underline creation. How that creation took place, there you might see a difference between the modern and the postmodern Adventist. The modern Adventist who would tend to be more like plain reading. This is 6 days in a period of a week as we know it today, like our fundamental belief numbers 6 says, whereas postmoderns may say, well, yes, somehow God is responsible. We are a created being. He is the creator. How he did it, what processes he used, I don't know. And I'm willing to have a diversity of opinion with regard to that, also in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But the basic fact that we are created beings and that God is the creator somehow, and that he created the Sabbath for our happiness, yes, that a postmodern Adventist would need to make sure that that is part of how he looks at things. Now, when it comes to standards, yes, I would like to refer to what I earlier said today, and that is we need standards, ethical standards, moral standards. The difference is that the modern Christian, the modern Seventh-day Adventist would say, and I have this exact list, and you'll have to abide by that exact list. Whereas the postmodern Adventist would say, yes, I've got a brain, thank God, and I see the principles that have been given in Scripture, and some would say in the writings of Mrs. White. I have these principles, and now I have been given the responsibility to apply those in my particular set of circumstances. And if my application is somewhat different from that of my brother, that shouldn't worry me, and it shouldn't worry him. But that does not take away from the fact that standards are important. In fact, I would argue that many of the more postmodern Adventists are more serious about standards and are not just abiding by a list that they can tick off, but are really giving some thought to what they ought to do as a Christian from a Christian perspective. And well, you link your number 2 with your number 3, environmental standards, engineering standards, and so on. Sure, we ought to be consistent, and I would suggest that in many ways the postmodern Adventist is more consistent in applying standards and is not, for instance, when dealing with stewardship, the principle of stewardship, not just thinking of some aspect of his monetary responsibilities, tithing, not just thinking of health in terms of not eating pork, but is trying to interpret that stewardship also as having ecological consequences and is having consequences for the way he deals with the with what we have available on this earth. So I think the postmodern Seventh-day Adventist would probably tend to be more consistent in that respect than the modern Seventh-day Adventist. The meta-narratives, when you mentioned the thermodynamics and the anthropic principle, I would say that when it comes to the meta-narrative of science, of course, scientific laws, at least to some extent, and this is really a domain where my knowledge is very, very little limited. But the postmodern person would say that science is not the panacea for everything. It does not give the solution for everything. And some science is not positive, but is negative. So yes, we need science, but we need to deal with science in a responsible way. It is not worshipped by the postmodern person as it was by the modern person. But certainly, so if your narrative is that everything is must be related to use of science, etc., then I would say no, that meta-narrative is limited. Science is part of what we do. It's an important part, but also there we need to be critical and give it a certain place. Well, I don't know, Brother McKinley, whether I more or less answered your 4 points.
Yes,
tried.
you did. Yes, you did. Thank you very much. And then just 15 seconds for us here. The other big meta-narrative, and now this is not with respect to Adventists necessarily, but from the videos that Dr. Larson shared, the general discussion of the framework of postmodernism kind of rejected the meta-narrative of what we believe as Christians to be God's salvation project. And yet I find that the entropies that I mentioned earlier, the entropies of suffering, the entropies of dying, the entropies of decay, the God's salvation project responds to all of those by proposing solutions to reverse the entropy of suffering, the entropy of failures, the entropy of death. And so I think that the secularist postmodern view rejecting that salvation narrative is challenging for me. Thank you.
Yes, and my short comment would be that I completely agree, and that although it's true that we have to reject certain narratives, meta-narratives, that the fact that there is no meta-narrative is in itself a meta-narrative that we do not buy into. And I think we have every right as Christians to insist that the Jesus story, or you can call it the salvation project, is a meta-narrative that we want to accept. We may not be able to prove it, but that's something, like I mentioned last time, is something that as Christians we want to believe in and want to proclaim it. And so, yes, I agree with you with regard to that point.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Reinder. I'm going to go to Juan. There you go.
Okay, well, thank you, Pastor Bruinsma, for your expose today, as well as previous weeks. If I understood well, you presented from a sociological perspective the challenges that the Seventh-day Adventists at the individual, community, and the organizational level exist. And in your contrasting between modernity and postmodernity and some of the things that fall into one versus the other, I can see a parallelism also as far as the time. By that I mean the personal time and also the organizational time. New churches have a sociological development as well as individuals and as well as organizations. And some of the things that my question is, what is related to the background philosophical approach, modernity versus postmodernity, or is just a consequence that the Adventism in some countries or in some communities, or as we get older in life, I mean, we move our viewpoints, our practices, and our understanding. So what is basically a development of time versus philosophy?
That's a complicated one, I think. There definitely, I think, is a progress, or sometimes the lack thereof. And you see in certain countries and in certain local churches a certain development, gradually leaving certain things and buying into some other things. But every country or every region of the world has gone through a different kind of history, and there's where your time element comes in. And one important element has been the fact that we came from the West and went to the other part of the world. And there, in the late 19th century, and the early 20th century, we brought our ideas and we brought our customs. And now we go back to them and say, well, look, that is modern. And, we want you to change. Whereas we should remember that many of the things that are now part and parcel of the faith experience of people around the world is something that we have introduced there a couple of generations ago. So that makes it pretty complicated. There are also other areas that have had far less communication with the rest of Adventism. Now, for instance, when you see in Western Europe, there are quite a few major Romanian churches, and they tend to be more modern. Some would say more traditional. Some would say more old-fashioned. But the reality is that, first of all, most of these Adventists came from rural backgrounds. They have lived under a system which did not allow any contact with the rest of Adventism. Then they migrated to another country where they had to establish their own kind of identity in their own kind of community. And so they brought a different kind of Adventism with them. And they are now kind of, some would say, stuck in that type of Adventism and feel very uncomfortable with the kind of Adventism that they now find in their new country. But when they go back home for holidays or move back, then they find that where they came from in Romania, and now I'm picking on Romania, but this would be applied to other communities as well. They find that things have changed in their, or are changing in the country where they originally came from. And they often do not feel comfortable with what they find now, the changes that have occurred at home. So it's a complicated thing, and we are not all in the same kind of time frame, as you correctly say. Underlying that, though, is also the fundamental issue as how we read the Bible. Because we also have many people around us, and you have them in the Loma area, and we have them in our churches, and educated people, but they read the Bible differently from the way most people in this Sabbath school class read the Bible. And many of what is modern is based also on a modern way of reading the Bible, and that's where the underlying difficulty is. So if you have an approach of plain reading, then of course you cannot allow for diversity of opinion, and you cannot allow for some of the things that the postmoderns are pleading for. So I think, Brother Juan, it is a complicated, but that you are right, that the time thing has a definite impact, and the fact also that we actually, and I think that's important, that we actually brought some of our ideas to some of these countries, regions of the world, and then that has been accepted, that has become standard teaching, and we cannot really blame people in those areas that they stay loyal to what they have been taught. But maybe I should add this. A couple of years ago, I wrote a little book, Facing Doubt. And some of you may have read that. And it's surprising
I did read this book.
It's basically quite postmodern in many ways.
Yes.
And I don't apologize for that. But it's surprising how many reactions I got from all over the world, not just from the Western countries. People saying, you know, you're describing me because this is how I am. And that came from South America, and that came from Asia and all over the world. So that to me has given me also reason to believe that the number of people that are struggling with this, without being able to give a name to it, is far larger than maybe Dr. Larson was thinking.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to David at this time because he's looking at his time schedule there. So David, with your question from Norway.
Yes, thank you, Forrest. I have a comment here that came in on Facebook from a person in Europe that you may know, Dr. Bruinsma, and I will savage his name because I don't know properly how to pronounce it, but I would say something like this: Ole Edvin Udiker. Does that name, I think he's from Scandinavia. He's an academic, and I have had some encounter with him, though I haven't met him personally. Do you know him?
I'm not sure. Well, of course, Ole is a very Scandinavian name.
Okay.
But
all right.
I suppose you do mishandle, the name somewhat. How is it spelled?
The last name is Utaker.
Utica. Yeah.
Utica.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I've met him. I have an idea that I know who he is. Yes. Okay.
Yes. He's an academic, and I've interacted with him in other settings, although I don't have a personal acquaintance with him. But this is what he wrote: "What unites us is more important than what separates us. It's a question of diversity versus uniformity. Choose." Now, if I could add something to it, and that is, last night, the new president of the North American Division spoke to the members of the American Society for Religious Studies and the Adventist Theological Society, both. And after his talk, there was a question and answer period, and he was asked, well, what would you like to see happen in your tenure as leader of the North American Division? And his answer, I thought, was very healing. He said, I would like to emphasize the things we hold in common rather than spending so much time on the things that we don't hold in common. And he said, over the last several years, we've spent a lot of time talking about those things which we find ourselves differing on, but I would like to spend the next few years talking about and thinking about and working together with those things that we hold in common. So this goes along with Professor Udiker's comment, and I think it's a good one.
Yes, and I would agree with that. And we sometimes, and maybe I've been guilty of that, also exaggerate or focus too much on the differences and on the challenges, because when we look at our own faith community, we are still remarkably united. When you look at some other faith communities, global communities, they have splintered far more than we have. So yes, there are tensions, but we're still mainly, at least organically, united. And I think when we look at our main doctrines, then we may have different interpretations, but there is an underlying unity that is significant. You know, we talked about the inspiration of the Bible. Well, we all have a high view of the Bible, in spite of the differences that we have. When we talk about the Sabbath, worldwide, all Seventh-day Adventists embrace the Sabbath, even though some may go to the beach and some may not go to the beach on Sabbath. We may differ in the way we celebrate the Sabbath, but we all are embracing the Sabbath. The second coming, we may differ with regard to the end time event and the order of those events, but we are united on believing that Christ will come back and that will solve the solution for the problems of the world. The state of the dead, and the idea that we are stewards, and so on. So in spite of all the differences, yes, I think we have a very solid basis on which we can build. And if the new president can do that, that would be refreshing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Rodney Corker at this point. Okay, you're on.
Reinder, I can relate to pretty much everything that you said about Seventh-day Adventism and the descriptions and observations that you've made. I don't have any problem with that. My problem is with what I see as the dark underbelly of some of the teachings of postmodernism, Leotard, and the annihilation of meta-narratives. I watched last night a video by what I believe was an Adventist philosopher, a young Adventist girl who whirled and twirled her way and word spun her way through 28 minutes and then came up with 3 postmodern in 2 minutes suggestions of what postmodern education should be. But they would be familiar to any credible educator who'd been teaching for a long, long time. The first suggestion was the Bible should be told as stories. The Bible was written as stories and has always been told as stories. So I'm not sure that that was an illustration at all of a postmodern paradigm. In fact, I want to suggest that a postmodern paradigm is not really a paradigm at all. And I want to take, I'll do this, David, in less than a minute, but I want to make several points of things that can be lost here and in their annihilation be replaced with some new meta-narrative that forces something on us that is really invalid and is really quite dangerous. And so I want to address the danger of being drawn into a framework that has very little utility, very little value, and maybe quickly becomes a mega narrative in itself that we should set aside and look for something else. And I praise you for looking for balance. But Lyotard is not looking for balance. These French philosophers out there are saying we need to annihilate and extinguish the meta-narratives. Now that is dangerous because the question is, what is going to replace it? And that will lead to paranoia. That leads to paranoia about a new world order. And I listen to this stuff and I can understand why Brexit occurred, why the English wanted to get out of Europe. Because if this stuff is swirling around Brussels, you know, it's like the British in the end are very practical people. They like their regalia. They like their sovereignty. They like everything Anglo. You know, there's things that they want to preserve and away that they go. But the things that I struggled with is that it marginalized the very skills necessary to move on to a new and useful paradigm. You talked about deconstruction. That's a gift from modernity. Reductionism, modernism again. Synthesis, that comes from modernism. Science comes from modernism. Paradigms that bring clarity in a language are gifts from modernism. Synergy is a modernist concept, and progress is one of my favorite words, and it comes from modernism. The analytic process is being marginalized by this philosophy. The therapeutic process of health and medicine gets marginalized because it embodies this great mega narrative. And so I struggle with it. I'm an economist. I have 2 hands. On one hand, I have optimism, ordered, cogent, structured thinking, stable platforms, reality-based thinking, evidence-based facts to work with. I live in a cognitive domain where I strive for logic and rational progression. On the other hand, I have postmodernism, which, as you started by saying and warned me, is pessimistic, often not cogent, relaxed definitions, are unstructured, unstable, often chaotic. And I like to think God, the God that I worship, prefers order to chaos. It's imaginative, free form, and is often full with feelings. You live in the affective domain, and intuition and individuality is really important. I can transverse my corpus callosum into that part of my brain, and I can have a good time with it. But my feet and my brain live in that modernistic, logical modern era, and I love it. I like to stay there. But my real problem here is anyone who's read Karen Armstrong's book on the history of God, and there are 4 key elements that all Abrahamic religions and Hinduism and Buddhism have in common, and they're hospitality, compassion, self-transcendence, and justice. So are we to set these mega narratives aside that have existed for centuries and that we practice all the time? Is this the mega narrative that they say this has to be extinguished? God help us all. This puts us on a road to being barbarians, you know? So be careful about the extremes of postmodernism. These things should not be relegated or archived to museum pieces that young people come by and look at and say, well, that's what our forebears believed in. If you want to see postmodernism up close and personal and destructive, watch a film that the French produced in 1918, and it was in the top 5 foreign films in the Academy Awards, and it's called Les Miserables. It was The Miserables, and it's life in the Parisian suburbs. Force yourself to watch it and ask yourself one question: do we want more of this? Is this really what we want in America? Now, it also marginalizes the good news of the gospel, words and concepts that I find invigorating and beautiful. What about peace, trust, faith, hope, joy, forgiveness, tolerance, patience? Are these all to be archived in a museum? Are these to be set aside and extinguished? Gosh, heaven help us all. I'm borrowing a benediction from Nito from a couple of weeks ago. If we get separated from science and these enduring mega narratives, and if we get separated from them, then it really is a matter, I think, of God help us all. The problem here is it's not with the narratives that I just read out and not those messages. We've got a problem with translation. As Karen said a couple of weeks ago, is that it's not words, it's not the concept that's the problem, it's us. We haven't translated it well, you know, but don't blame the concept and the words here. And just to finish with, it marginalizes many of my favorite words and concepts: love, honor, commitment, loyalty, chivalry, gallantry, kindness, charity, the definition of what it is to be a lady, what it is to be a gentleman, the nobility and satisfaction of a life of service, sacrifice, the power of humility. Goodness me, are we to extinguish these blessings, these mega narratives that have endured for centuries? God help us all. So, Reinder, when you go back to Europe or down to France, there's only a handful of these French philosophers. You can get them all in one room, I believe, but tell them to do better. Give us something that's prescriptive. Give us something that is noble, that brings civilization forward, something that is more positive, a more positive platform. So I thank you for your really positive presentations on warranted beliefs. That was wonderful. And you did warn us that postmodernism was embedded in pessimism. I've done the journey, but I really look forward to your next book. Is it going to be optimistic and positive? That's my question.
Okay.
And thank you for tolerating my rant.
Well, that was a long question. And I think that, because part of the issue that you state is, well, 2 things. Maybe you use the word meta-narrative in some ways rather too broadly, as for many of the ideas that are valuable and that you want to keep, you use the word meta-narrative. For many of the postmoderns, the meta-narrative is something that is bigger than that, and that does encompass all of these various things that should fit under their one and only philosophy. And I think that they have criticized some of these meta-narratives of the past with reason. But the other thing that you said is that the extremes, and yes, that is where we have to be very, very careful. That and we should not buy into everything that the postmodern philosophers are giving us. It is very often indeed quite negative. Now, I cannot go to these philosophers because they're all dead. But so there's a little problem there. But what we said earlier in the discussion, we have every right as Christians to say, well, we have a framework in which all these things that we value will fit. That is the framework of the story of Christ, call it the plan of redemption, the framework of salvation. Yeah, there are different ways one would. So, yeah, I really don't know what to say else than that we must avoid extremes. When there are evangelical Christians who say that everything postmodern is evil, and then they go back to a form of fundamentalism or something that just is not appealing to people today anymore, that doesn't answer the concerns that people have today. So that attitude, everything is evil, as well as everything is gospel, have to be avoided. But what I'm mainly pleading for in this small series is, let's be sure that we know where postmodern people are coming from. Let's try to understand what it is, the difference, and why we think differently, because we come from different angles. And let's try to talk to one another, try that we understand one another. And I think what was just said by our Norwegian friend and by the president of the North American division, let's build on what we have in common, not throw away the things of the past that are worthwhile. At the same time, open up some windows in our community so that we can all have breathing space.
Thank you. And we'll get there, not through a forced dichotomy, but through the very words that you said. So I appreciate, I think your descriptions and observations were very accurate. The issues are accurate. I don't want to trivialize the dark underbelly of going to the extreme that I'm hearing on some of the videos. Some of these philosophers, if you want to call them that, would take us. Once you start to use words like extinguish the narrative, then my ears go up and my alarm bells go off, as they should do with all of us.
Rightly so.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to interrupt here just for a second. I need to leave, and Forrest, if you can stay by, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll have a postmodern meeting with no leader, and we'll just have it go that way. I'm going to encourage others to join me in the panel discussion, and I've sent you a link for that. I hope it works. I think it will, because I think this will be a very interesting discussion. Now, with respect to what Rodney just said, we need to understand that Rodney is not some kind of atavistic regressive. Okay, he's not coming out from some dark intellectual rock like a lizard, right? No, he's a very thoughtful and informed person. So we need to take what he has to say seriously. We don't have time just now to do so, but we will. Postmodernism, by definition, is pluralistic. The ones we have been hearing about mostly are French, and many of them are disillusioned Stalinists. Stalinism was the meta-narrative that let them down, and they feel a little disillusioned by that. But there are other forms of postmodernism that are more hopeful. one has to, I will not give up modernism, because modernism is what allows you and me to speak together today. Modernism is what gave us the scientific method. Modernism is what gave us improved medicine. So I'm not prepared to do that. On the other hand, I think we can learn from postmodernisms about a lot of things that are valuable. So what we're striking for here is balance. That's the word that Dr. Bruinsma has used all along, balance. And we will continue to do that. But we're not going to rush through this series. We're going to take our time, because this is very, very important. Now, Danilo and Jeff and Eduardo are still on board.
And I got Peter as well. Peter as well.
Okay. Okay, let's begin the discussion next time with these 4 people. And then after that, we can go on. That I'm reluctant to walk away seeing those hands up, because they all have important things to say. So farewell from me for now, and I'll see you in a week. And I
Wait,
hope to see some of you this afternoon.
How did you send that link?
I sent it on email to you. Would you like to check to see if it's there?
I don't see it. That's why I'm asking.
We're looking.
And I think that the suggestion that you just made is that we pick it up there next week, because what we are going to do next week will fit with what we have been doing today. And that is the question of what would Jesus deconstruct? And the title is taken from this book, but I will not go exactly the way that Mr. Caputo is going. But we will continue the kind of things that we were talking about today. And so I think the suggestion is good, that we will start a discussion next week with the people that wanted to ask questions.
Okay, and I'll send you some videos by John Caputo. He is a fascinating person. Now, don't think that the videos I send you, I endorse. I'm trying to give you a sense of what's going on there, and I have my reservations, and I have places where I applaud. John Caputo is an exotic person. I think that's what Roy Branson would say. He's exotic, and so you'll enjoy him, and he has something to say, but we have something to say too. So thank you, everybody. Everybody's participation makes this series exceedingly rich, and we will continue it next week.
And I have the names written down for next week.
Wow.
So I guess, are we going to,
So that, does that mean that if we came this time, we'll get be involved when it comes for next week?
okay. Yeah,
I don't have the
I
link.
think we'll,
I know.
I'm willing to keep the meeting going, but I'm saying, I think Dr. Bruinsma wants to retire from the battlefield today. The field of honor.
Not necessarily, but I think that yeah, we can continue where we are now next week, because there's still a lot to be discussed.
Okay, all right. So I guess I'm going to do something here to leave it. And if anybody wants to stay on, go ahead. But we'll reserve the questions till next week. Thank you for pointing out.
Well, when-
We'll do.
Wait, did you all get the
Yes.
link that David was describing? Did anybody else get the link?
Yes,
I
I got
didn't
the
get-
link, Donna.
I didn't get it, and I was wondering.
I can forward it to you.
Please do. Thank
Will
you.
you
All right.
forward it? Will you be sure to, will you be
Okay.
sure to forward it to me too?
I don't know that I only have Donna's address. Maybe she can forward it to who else is asking.
But McKinley, was that from what, Roy Branson Legacy?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Miss Christian, Ruth, is it?
Yes.
Look under Roy Branson Legacy, and you should have that link. David had sent that to you.
I'll get it to Ruth.
Okay, all right, good enough. Thank you.
Mine went into junk.
Yeah, check your junk.
All right.
Hey, yeah.
See you all next week.
Auf Wiedersehen.
And
Thank you, Dr.
auf
Bruinsma.
Wiedersehen.
Forrest,
And have a very good week.
thank you.
And you, God
Great
bless.
presentation.
God bless.
Forrest,
Yeah.
Forrest, when was that email sent out by the Branson?
It was sent out this morning.
Wow, really?
I think I just got another email from you, so I forwarded that email to Donna.
Was that Bronwyn? Were you?
Yes,
responding?
it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
sent out at 11:25 from Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School, 11:25.
Yeah, I didn't get that one.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna have to work with this guy. We're gonna have to cut his pay if he doesn't get a better job.
Well, yes, I did, Bronwyn, I did get the email, so I don't know why
Okay.
others are not showing. Jeff, would you let Donna know that I emailed the link to her,
Yeah.
please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Have a happy Sabbath. Forrest, thank you for queuing me up. I will send you a
Oh.
gift.
Yeah, I'll give you my Zelle account so you can deposit money into it if you want.
Have a great Sabbath. Bye.
You're a good man, Forrest.
Hi, Bronwyn. Have a good Sabbath, Bronwyn.
Thank you, McKinley.